The barrel of a suppressed Sig Sauer trembled against the freezing wind, aimed directly at the heart of a man who looked like he'd been dragged through hell. "Step away from the dog, or I bury you right here," Elena screamed, her voice cutting through the blizzard. The man didn't flinch. He didn't even look up. He kept working on the heavy iron shackle cutting into the K9's neck. He wasn't a criminal. He was a Navy SEAL, and he knew something she didn't. Subscribe now and join us on this harrowing journey. Comment your city below so I can see how far our story travels. I said step back. Elena's finger tightened on the trigger. Her breath hitched in the sub-zero air. The man, Jackson, finally looked up. His eyes weren't those of a killer. They were hollowed out by a decade of shadows. "If you fire that weapon, Agent, you trigger a silent pulse," he rasped, his voice sounding like grinding gravel. "The dog isn't just an animal. He's a live link to a kill switch that will level this entire ridge." Elena didn't drop her guard. "You expect me to believe a veteran Navy SEAL is out here playing hero while his hands are covered in grease and wire cutters? Believe what you want, but look at the collar," Jackson countered, his movements agonizingly slow. "It's not a leash. It's a bomb." Elena peered through the driving snow. The K9, a battle-worn Belgian Malinois, wasn't growling. It was trembling, its eyes fixed on a glowing red sensor embedded in its tactical harness. The dog was holding perfectly still, a silent guardian against an explosion that would erase the evidence of a government-sanctioned atrocity. "Why you?" Elena demanded, taking a half-step closer. "Because I built the damn thing," Jackson whispered. The admission hit her like a physical blow. "I didn't know they were using live K9 units for the field tests. I thought it was just hardware. I quit the program 3 days ago, and they sent a cleanup crew after me. We're being watched, Agent. Not by the wind, but by thermals." Mini-climax. A red laser dot flickered across the snow, hovering millimeters from Elena's shoulder. "Get down!" Jackson lunged, tackling Elena into a snowbank, just as a high-velocity round chewed into the frozen tree trunk where she had been standing. The sound of the gunshot was swallowed by the storm, but the impact was unmistakable. "They're not here to talk," Jackson growled, pulling a tactical knife and slicing through the K9's binding. "Who is they?" Elena scrambled to her feet, her training taking over. She didn't trust him, but she trusted the bullet hole in the tree. "The agency you work for," he replied, his face grim. Elena felt the ground shift under her feet. Her entire career, every mission she'd led, every directive she'd followed, was it all a lie? Major twist, approximately 5 minutes. The K9 suddenly bolted, not away from the danger, but directly toward the ridge where the sniper was hiding. It didn't howl. It just ran like a tactical strike force of one. "No, he's going to trigger it!" Jackson shouted, his composure shattering. "If he triggers it, he dies!" Elena yelled back, already sprinting after the dog. "If he triggers it, we all die!" They raced across the treacherous terrain, the blizzard turning the world into a chaotic blur of white. The dog, Shadow, vanished into the tree line. Moments later, a massive, muffled thump shook the earth, but it wasn't an explosion. It was the sound of a struggle. A man's scream, quickly silenced. Mini-climax. They reached the clearing. The sniper lay unconscious, but the K9 had vanished again, leaving a trail of blood on the pristine snow. "He's wounded," Elena said, her voice softening for the first time. She knelt, inspecting the tracks. He's leading us somewhere. He's not leading us, Elena, Jackson said, his gaze fixed on a buried hatch hidden beneath a pile of pine branches. He's taking us to the source, the reason they wanted us both dead. Elena looked at the hatch. A heavy, reinforced steel door stamped with the insignia of a Black Ops project that supposedly never existed. She looked at Jackson. You knew this was here. I knew it existed, he corrected, his voice tight. I didn't know it was in my own backyard. Why didn't you go alone? Because you have the biometric key to the digital logs, and you don't even know it, he said, stepping closer. The FBI didn't send you here to save a dog. They sent you here to be the scapegoat when this facility blows up. Major twist, approximately 10 minutes. Elena reached for her badge, her hand shaking. As she pulled it out, she saw something she'd never noticed before. The holographic seal on the back of her ID wasn't just a shield. It was an encrypted transmitter. It's a tracker, Elena whispered, her blood running cold. They've been listening to everything. Every word we've said since I arrived. Then we're already ghosts, Jackson said, his hand hovering over his holster. Are we going to die here, or are we going to burn this place to the ground? Elena didn't answer. She smashed her badge into a nearby rock, shattering the plastic. I'm not dying for a lie, she said, her voice steady. Suddenly the ground beneath the hatch groaned. A low, electronic hum echoed through the forest. The K-9 reappeared, standing on the hatch, barking, not at them, but at the sky. A drone, small and deadly, descended through the clouds. Down! Jackson tackled her again. But this time, they didn't scramble for cover. They moved as a unit. Elena pulled her sidearm, eyes locked on the drone, while Jackson moved to the hatch lock. Give me 3 seconds, he yelled over the whine of the drone's rotors. You have 2! The drone fired a warning shot that turned the ground into a fountain of dirt. Elena returned fire, her shots rhythmic and precise, drawing the drone's attention away from the hatch. She wasn't just a federal agent anymore. She was a target, and the hunted had decided to start hunting back. Mini-climax. The hatch lock clicked, but instead of opening, it hissed. A toxic vapor leaking from the seal. Gas! Jackson screamed, pulling his scarf over his nose. They rigged it! The dog! Elena saw Shadow darting toward the toxic cloud, his ears pinned back, head down. He's trying to clear the vent, Jackson realized, his eyes widening. He's been trained for this. He's going to choke. Elena didn't think. She lunged into the vapor, grabbing the dog by the harness and yanking him back just as the pressure blew the door off its hinges. The force of the blast sent them flying backward, and deep into the brush. Silence followed, not the peaceful silence of the forest, but the heavy, expectant silence of a grave. Elena? Jackson crawled through the debris, coughing. She was lying on her back, the K-9 curled against her chest, shivering violently. She looked up at the sky, watching the drone spiral out of control, hit by the debris from the hatch. I'm here, she whispered, grabbing her sidearm and checking the chamber. But we aren't alone anymore. From the tree line, dozens of red laser dots emerged, dancing across the trees. They were surrounded. How many? She asked, her voice calm. Too many, Jackson replied, pulling a heavy-duty magazine from his kit. You ready to find out what kind of monster you've been working for? Elena gripped the dog's collar, her eyes locking onto the dark horizon. I've been ready for a long time. Major twist, approximately 15 minutes. A voice boomed from a concealed speaker in the trees, a voice Elena recognized immediately. It was her own supervisor. "Agent Vance, you've reached the end of your utility. Step away from the seal, and we might make this quick." Elena looked at Jackson. "That's my boss." Jackson smirked, a dark, dangerous look. "Then I guess we're both in the right place." The voice crackled again, cold and mechanical, cutting through the freezing air. "Agent Vance, you are a liability. Terminate the seal and secure the K9. This is your final directive." Elena's hand tightened around the grip of her sidearm. She didn't look at the trees where the lasers danced. She looked at Jackson. "My boss just called me a liability. That's a promotion in this mess, isn't it?" Jackson didn't smile. He shifted his weight, his eyes scanning the dark perimeter. "They're not moving in yet because they need the biometrics from that collar. The dog has the encryption keys for the entire facility. If we kill the dog, they lose everything. If they kill us, they lose the only people who know how to bypass the fail-safes. We aren't liabilities, Elena. We're hostages." "Then we stop being hostages," she snapped. She grabbed the collar off the K9 Shadow and with a swift, practiced motion, ripped the internal module loose. The red sensor on the dog's chest blinked rapidly and then went dark. Instantly, the woods erupted. Not with gunfire, but with the high-pitched whine of a sonic deterrent. Elena collapsed, clutching her head as a wave of nausea rolled over her. Beside her, Shadow didn't whimper. The dog let out a sharp, piercing bark and lunged into the dark, ignoring the sonic pulse. "Stay with me." Jackson grabbed her jacket, dragging her behind a concrete slab protruding from the hillside. "The dog knows the kill zone. Follow his lead." "He's running straight into their line of sight," Elena gasped, fighting the ringing in her ears. "No, he's running into their blind spot. The perimeter sensors are tied to the frequency they just blasted. They've blinded their own cameras." Jackson didn't wait. He sprinted, his boots crunching on the frost, and Elena forced herself to follow. They dived into a narrow fissure in the rock just as a volley of rounds shredded the concrete where they had been hiding seconds before. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs, a drumbeat of pure adrenaline. She reached into her vest, pulling out a handful of signaling flares. "We don't need to outrun them," she whispered, her voice hardening. "We need to blind them back." She tossed a flare toward the tree line. The magnesium flare hissed, erupting in a blinding white light that would wash out every thermal optic in the forest. Jackson grinned, a sharp, dangerous expression. "Good thinking, Agent. Now let's see if your boss knows how to fight on the ground." They moved as a team, utilizing the chaos. Every step was a gamble. Elena found herself relying on the instincts of the dog, who led them through a maze of underground ventilation ducts. They popped up in the heart of the security monitoring station, a place that should have been locked tight. But the station was empty, the monitors dark, the systems fried. "It's a trap," Elena said, stopping dead. "No," Jackson corrected, pointing to the main server. "It's a purge, when they're deleting the evidence before they flatten the mountain." A shadow flickered in the doorway. Elena pivoted, her weapon leveled, but it was just a man in a tactical vest, a ghost of the organization. He didn't fire. He reached up, peeled off his mask, and Elena felt the world stop. It was her former mentor, Miller. "You were always the best student I had, Elena," Miller said, his voice devoid of warmth. "That's why you're the only one I'm giving a chance to walk away. Leave the seal. Leave the animal. Take the back exit, and I'll scrub your file." "You built this?" Elena asked, her voice trembling with a rage she'd never felt before. "I built a future where we don't have to wait for permission to do what's necessary," Miller replied, stepping closer. He held a detonator. "I didn't want to kill you. I wanted to use you." Jackson moved, but Miller's finger hovered over the trigger. "Don't, Seal. This entire mountain is packed with enough C4 to rewrite the geography. If you move, we all disappear." Elena looked at Shadow, who sat perfectly still at her feet. The dog wasn't looking at Miller. He was looking at a small, pressurized canister mounted on the wall behind Miller's head, a fire suppression system. "You think you've won because you have a button?" Elena asked, keeping Miller's gaze fixed on hers. "I know I've won because I have no conscience," Miller retorted. Elena caught the flicker of Shadow's eyes toward the canister. She didn't look back. She made a subtle gesture, a snap of her fingers, and Shadow lunged, not at Miller, but at the power line running alongside the wall. Sparks showered the room. The fire suppression system triggered, blasting a wall of CO2 and chemical foam into the air. Visibility dropped to 0 in a heartbeat. Miller fired blindly into the white haze. Elena dove, sweeping his legs out from under him. The detonator skittered across the floor, sliding toward the edge of the open floor grate. Jackson tackled Miller, pinning him, but the detonator was already falling. "Get it!" Jackson roared. Elena dove, her fingers catching the edge of the metal casing just as it tumbled into the abyss of the sublevel. She hauled it back, her lungs burning, but Miller was already reaching for a secondary blade hidden in his boot. The struggle turned primal. No more tactics, no more training. It was survival, fueled by the betrayal that burned in Elena's veins. She didn't use the gun. She used the weight of her conviction. She slammed Miller into the console, the screens shattering under the impact. "Why?" she screamed, pinning him by his throat. Miller laughed, blood bubbling on his lip. "Because the truth is a lie we tell to sleep at night, Elena. Look at the data." He pointed to a blinking red light on a handheld device in his pocket. It wasn't a detonator. It was a live feed of thousands of names. Innocent people, marked for a project that had already begun. "You didn't stop anything," Miller wheezed. "You're just part of the sequence." Before Elena could respond, a heavy thud shook the station. The floor began to tilt. They hadn't detonated the mountain, but they had triggered a structural collapse. The walls groaned, concrete cracking like glass. "We have to go!" Jackson shouted, dragging her away from the monitor. "We can't leave this!" Elena grabbed the data drive, ripping it from the port. "The building is coming down, Elena. The dog's already gone." Elena looked at the ceiling, watching dust and debris rain down. She realized then that Miller hadn't been stalling to kill them. He had been stalling to ensure they were trapped when the facility self-destructed. She looked at the door, then back at Miller, who was struggling to crawl toward the exit. She stood up, grabbed Jackson, and didn't look back. They hit the hallway as the ceiling collapsed behind them, the sound of 1,000 tons of rock burying the truth forever. They stumbled out into the cold night air, the mountain trembling beneath their feet. Shadow was waiting by the tree line, his fur matted with snow, his eyes fixed on the entrance they had just escaped. "We're alive," Jackson panted, leaning against a pine tree. Elena clutched the drive to her chest, her fingers white. "We're alive," she repeated, "but we're not free." as the facility vanished into a sinkhole of dust and debris. A single siren wailed in the distance. The rescue crews were coming, but they weren't the good guys. And in the dark, watching the flames lick the sky, Elena knew the real fight had only just begun. She checked her pulse, then checked the dog. He was breathing. A low, steady sound in the chaos. "What now?" Jackson asked, watching the horizon. Elena looked at the data drive, then toward the valley where the world lived, oblivious to the monsters living in their shadow. "Now," she said, "we make sure everyone knows exactly who we're fighting." The sirens were getting louder, piercing through the cold mountain air like a jagged blade. Elena didn't look back at the crater where the station once stood. Her eyes were fixed on the valley floor, where the strobe lights of tactical response teams were already flickering against the pines. "They aren't here for a rescue, Elena," Jackson said, his voice hard as stone. He shoved a heavy bag of digital evidence into her arms. She said, "They're here to sanitize. If they find us with that drive, we don't go to jail. We simply vanish." "I have contacts," Elena countered, though her hand trembled slightly. "People inside the bureau who don't report to Miller." "Miller was the tip of the spear," Jackson replied, his grip on his sidearm intensifying. "If he's gone, the ones above him are already scrubbing the board. We need to go dark, and we need to do it now." He signaled to the K-9, Shadow, who gave a low, so sharp bark and darted toward a dense thicket of old-growth spruce. They followed, moving through the underbrush with the practiced silence of ghosts. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot. "We're being hunted," Elena whispered, stopping to listen. The hum of a drone echoed above them, far higher than the last one. "They aren't using ground troops anymore. They're using thermal imaging from the air." "Then we make them think we're already dead," Jackson said. He stopped at a small, frozen stream. "We split the gear. You take the drive and get to the extraction point in the valley. I'll lead them in the opposite direction." "No," Elena said, her voice cutting through his plan. "We stay together. If you go, they kill you in minutes. If we go together, we have a chance to hit the grid." "You don't understand, Elena." Jackson stepped into her space, his eyes intense. "I didn't quit the program because of a moral crisis. I quit because I found out they were tracking my bloodline. My brother was one of the first test subjects. He didn't survive the transition." The revelation hit Elena like a physical blow. The complexity of the conspiracy deepened, shifting from a simple betrayal to a generational nightmare. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you were an agent of the system," he snapped, "and I wasn't sure if you were a savior or a trap." Before she could answer, Shadow went rigid, his hackles raised. He lunged, not at a person, but at a cluster of brush. A hidden tripwire snapped, and a flashbang detonated, blinding them instantly. "Get down!" Jackson roared, tackling Elena into the dirt as a barrage of suppressed fire chewed up the earth around them. The air smelled of ozone and cordite. Elena felt a sharp sting in her shoulder, but she didn't cry out. She grabbed her weapon, firing into the white light of the flashbang's aftermath. A figure dropped, then another. They weren't just tactical units, they were elite cleaners. "Move!" Jackson pushed her forward. They scrambled over a ridge, their lungs burning, the cold air turning to frost in their throats. "The extraction point is 2 miles, Elena gasped, clutching her bleeding shoulder. "If we can reach the highway, we can hijack a signal." "If we make it," Jackson said grimly. He looked at Shadow, who was limping, his paw cut by a jagged rock. Elena knelt, pulling a bandage from her kit and wrapping the dog's foot. "He stays with us," she whispered, her eyes meeting the dog's. Shadow let out a soft whine and licked her hand. A small moment of humanity in a world of machines. A red laser dot suddenly tracked across Elena's chest. She reacted before thinking, rolling behind a boulder. The rock face exploded in a shower of granite fragments. "They're using snipers now," she shouted. "They're losing their patience," Jackson muttered. He checked his magazine. He had 3 rounds left. "Elena, if this goes sideways, take the drive and burn it. Don't let them have the data. Don't let them win." "I'm not burning anything," she said, pulling a hidden backup flash drive from her boot. "I already uploaded the encrypted files to a cloud-based server set to auto-publish if I don't provide a biometric heartbeat every 2 hours. If they kill me, the truth goes public." Jackson stared at her, a flicker of genuine respect in his eyes. "So, you played the game better than I thought." "I'm an FBI agent," she replied, a bitter smile touching her lips. "I'm trained for contingencies." The forest went eerily quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then, a voice boomed from a loudspeaker mounted on a nearby drone. "Agent Vance, surrender the device and the seal, and we promise a clean termination." Elena looked at the device in her hand. It was the key to everything. She looked at Jackson, then at the K9. She realized that the betrayal reached much higher than she ever imagined. Her entire department had been compromised long before she even signed her oath. "We don't surrender!" Elena shouted at the sky. She turned to Jackson and nodded. Together they charged out from behind the boulder, not toward the extraction point, but toward the drone. Shadow led the way, his instincts guiding them through the tactical gaps in the enemy's formation. They weren't just running, they were closing the distance. As they neared the drone, Jackson used his tactical knife to hook the landing gear, pulling it down into the brush. The drone crashed, sparking and shrieking. In the confusion, Elena saw the sniper, a familiar face, one of her former team members, caught off guard. She leveled her pistol. "It's over, Miller's ghost." The sniper froze, hands raised. Elena stepped forward, but the ground suddenly gave way. It was a secondary trap, a pit masked by forest debris. They tumbled into the darkness, the world spinning as they hit the bottom. Elena groaned, shaking off the disorientation. She looked up. The sky was a small square of light, surrounded by the faces of those who wanted her dead. "Well," Jackson rasped, wiping blood from his forehead. "At least we found where they keep their secrets." He shone his light around the pit. It wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was an entrance to a massive, subterranean tunnel system running beneath the entire mountain range. And at the end of the tunnel, lit by the eerie glow of computer terminals, was a room full of screens, all displaying live feeds of her own home. "They weren't just watching us, Elena," Jackson said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "They were waiting for us to lead them to the rest of the pack." Elena looked at the screens, the reality of the situation sinking in. This wasn't a containment operation. It was a harvest, and they were the bait. She tightened her grip on the drive, knowing that the only way out was through the heart of the monster that had been her entire life. "Then let's give them what they're waiting for," she said, her eyes burning with a cold, focused fury. She reached into her vest and pulled out a grenade she'd scavenged from the sniper. "We aren't just here to survive. We're here to end it." The grenade pinned to Elena's vest felt heavier than the weight of her entire career. She didn't hesitate. She primed it and hurled it not at the guards, but at the structural supports of the tunnel's main conduit. The resulting blast didn't just collapse the ceiling. It severed the power grid that kept the surveillance room operational. Darkness slammed into the room, absolute and suffocating, punctuated only by the dying whine of the electronic screens. "Move!" Elena grabbed Jackson's tactical vest, hauling him through the tunnel's maintenance hatch before the automated turrets could recalibrate. They sprinted through a labyrinth of damp stone and cables, their breath ragged. Behind them, the sounds of shouting and tactical boots hitting the floor grew louder. "They know we're in the sub-level now," Jackson panted, his hand pressed against a fresh wound on his side. "They won't be as careful with the hardware anymore." Elena didn't slow down. "We're not going to the surface. We're going to the nerve center. If we destroy the uplink, we kill the feed they're using to track everyone." "That's a suicide run, Elena. The nerve center is guarded by the inner circle," Jackson warned. "Everything they have is a suicide run," she countered. She looked at Shadow, who was tracking the scent of ozone and heated metal, the signature of a high-capacity server farm. The dog stopped at a reinforced steel door, his ears pinned back, he's growling low in his throat. Elena checked her remaining ammunition. 2 magazines, not enough for a battalion, but enough for a fight. "You take the left flank, I'll take the right. On 3. The door swung open, and they didn't wait for a greeting. Elena entered in a low crouch, her weapon cycling rhythmically as she engaged the 2 sentries guarding the primary terminal. Jackson followed, his movement a blurred extension of his SEAL training, clearing the room with surgical precision. As the last guard hit the floor, the room fell into a heavy, pulsing silence, dominated by the rhythmic hum of massive cooling fans. Elena stepped to the main console, her fingers flying across the keys. The data cascading across the screens wasn't just surveillance. It was a blueprint for a total takeover of federal communications. "It's not just watching," Elena whispered, her blood turning to ice. "They're rewriting the directives. If this goes live, sees every agent in the field will be forced into a kill chain they can't opt out of." "Then kill it," Jackson said, pulling a device from his pack, an electromagnetic pulse unit, modified from the very tech they'd been chasing. "This will fry every circuit within 50 yards, but it'll fry our comms too. We'll be blind." "Do it," Elena commanded. Before Jackson could trigger the device, the room's main monitor flickered to life. A face appeared. Not Miller, but someone higher. Someone Elena had sat across from in board meetings for years. It was the deputy director. "Agent Vance?" The voice was silky, devoid of any stress. "You've done remarkably well. You've brought the K9, the SEAL, and the drive to the exact location where we needed to finish the integration. You didn't steal the data. You delivered the final key." Elena froze, her hand hovering over the EMP trigger. "You were never losing us. You were waiting for us to find the main hub. You were the only one with the clearance to bypass the biometric lockdown." The deputy director smiled, a cold, predatory expression. "Thank you for your service, Elena. Now step away from the console and let the SEAL take the fall. We'll make sure your pension stays intact." Elena looked at Jackson. He was already leveling his weapon, not at the screens, but at her. "Elena, step back." "You're working for them?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "I'm working to get us out of here alive," Jackson retorted, his eyes darting to the door. "They've got a containment team outside. If we trigger that EMP, we're trapped in a room with no power and 30 armed men behind that door. If we don't, we lose the country," Elena said, her finger tightening on the EMP trigger. The door began to buckle under the weight of a heavy breach charge. Jackson didn't wait. He tackled Elena, knocking the EMP trigger from her hand. It skittered across the floor, sliding toward the server rack. "You fool!" Elena lunged for it, but Jackson pinned her, his face inches from hers. "I'm not a traitor, Elena. I'm a strategist. If we trigger that EMP now, the blast radius won't just kill the server. It'll trigger the room's secondary incendiary system. We'll be vaporized." The breach charge detonated, blowing the door off its hinges. Smoke filled the room, and the tactical team began to swarm. Elena didn't look at the soldiers. She looked at Shadow. The dog had disappeared into the shadows beneath the server racks. Suddenly, a massive surge of electricity arced from the power supply directly into the tactical team's gear. The soldiers screamed as their own electronic vests short-circuited. Shadow had bitten through the main conduit, creating a localized overload. Elena kicked Jackson off her, lunging for the fallen EMP trigger. She didn't wait for him to stand. She jammed it into the server terminal and slammed the activation button. The world went white. The hum of the servers died, replaced by a deafening metallic silence. The lights flickered and failed, leaving them in absolute darkness. "Did we get it?" Jackson's voice came from the black, strained and breathless. Elena checked the terminal. The screen was a jagged mess of dead pixels. She felt the heavy weight of the drive in her vest, the only copy of the truth left in the world. "We got the server," she whispered. "But we didn't get them." From the darkness of the hall, the sound of rhythmic, synchronized footsteps approached. They weren't using lights. They were using night vision. "They're coming for the drive," Jackson said, grabbing her arm. "We have to move." "Shadow!" Elena whistled, a sharp, piercing sound. A moment later, a warm, solid weight pressed against her leg. The dog was alive. But as she moved to follow Jackson, she saw something on the floor. A small, glowing device that hadn't been there before. It was a beacon. They aren't just sending soldiers, she realized, a chill running down her spine. They're calling in an airstrike. She grabbed Jackson and sprinted toward the only exit left, the ventilation shaft they'd used to enter. Behind them, the hum of an incoming jet ripped through the silence of the mountain, a predatory sound that meant the end of everything. They weren't just running from an organization anymore. They were running from a scorched earth policy that didn't care who was buried in the rubble. As they crawled into the darkness of the shaft, Elena looked back. The room was already glowing with the intense, unnatural light of a laser-guided strike. She clutched the drive and the dog, her heart a frantic rhythm against her ribs. They were deep in the belly of the mountain, and the mountain was about to become their tomb. The roar of the jet grew until it felt like the mountain itself was screaming. Elena and Jackson squeezed through the narrow ventilation shaft, the metal vibrating with the impending shockwave. Behind them, the server room vanished in a blinding flare of white heat. The strike had arrived, but they were already beneath the blast radius. The tunnel buckled, throwing them hard against the walls as the earth settled into a heavy, suffocating silence. "We're still here," Elena gasped, her voice thick with the taste of pulverized rock and burnt wiring. She crawled out of the debris, her hand finding Shadow's fur. The dog was unhurt, his tail giving a single tentative thump against the floor. "They'll think they got us," Jackson muttered, wiping blood from his eyes as he looked toward the surface. "They'll wait for the dust to settle, then send in the mop-up crew to confirm the kill." "Let them come," Elena said, her voice turning cold and steady. She pulled the data drive from her vest. It was the only thing that mattered now, the evidence that would topple an entire chain of command. "We have the drive. We have the proof. And we're the only ones who know the truth about what they're trying to build." They moved through the collapsed tunnels, guided by Shadow's instincts. Every turn felt like a final gamble, but the dog didn't hesitate. He knew the way out. They reached a forgotten drainage culvert that emptied into a frozen riverbank, miles from the epicenter of the destruction. As they emerged into the biting wind, they saw the lights of a convoy approaching from the valley. The cleanup team had arrived. "They have thermal," Jackson noted, checking his empty sidearm. "We can't outrun them in this terrain." "We don't need to outrun them," Elena replied. She looked at the drive, then at the flickering light of her own satellite phone, which had regained signal now that they were clear of the shielded facility. "I'm not calling for help. I'm broadcasting the decryption keys to every major news outlet in the country." "They'll track the signal instantly," Jackson warned. "That's the point," she smiled, a grim, final expression. "We're the bait. We lead them away from the upload point, and by the time they reach us, the world will already know." She hit send. The signal chirped, a small sound that changed the fate of the entire organization. Across the nation, secure servers began to decrypt files that had been hidden for decades. The cleanup crew saw the sudden change in activity on their tactical tablets. They stopped, confused, their formation breaking as they realized their own command and control network was being flooded with leaked data. "They're stalling," Jackson whispered, watching the convoy halt. "They don't know whether to catch us or stop the leak." "They're losing," Elena said. She stood up, her posture unbroken despite her injuries. The men in the convoy moved toward them, but they weren't moving with the precision of elite cleaners anymore. They were moving with the hesitation of men whose orders had just vanished. "Agent Vance!" a voice boomed from the lead truck's loudspeaker. It was the deputy director, but the confidence was gone. He sounded desperate. "Step away from the device and we can discuss the containment protocols. You're destroying a system that keeps this country safe. You're destroying the country to keep your secret safe," Elena shouted back, her voice echoing across the ice. She turned to Jackson. "Are you ready?" "Born ready," he said, drawing his tactical knife. The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. The deputy director stepped out of the vehicle, his hand on his weapon, but he didn't fire. He looked at the phones of his own men. They were all checking their devices, their faces illuminated by the glow of the leaked news alerts. The soldiers were looking at their leader, not with obedience, but with realization. "The order is dead," Jackson said, stepping forward. The soldiers shifted, lowering their rifles. The deputy director realized the truth in the same heartbeat. He had no army left to command. He reached for his gun, but before he could clear his holster, Shadow lunged, a blur of motion that knocked the man to the ground. Elena was there in a second, pinning him with the cold authority of an officer who had reclaimed her oath. "You're under arrest," she said, reading him his rights as the police sirens finally began to wail in the distance. Not the agency's private security, but local authorities tipped off by the very leak she had initiated. As the handcuffs clicked shut, the silence of the forest returned, but it felt different now. The tension was gone, replaced by the weight of justice. Jackson walked over to her, his hand resting on the dog's head. Shadow let out a long, exhausted sigh and collapsed into the snow, safe at last. Elena looked at the drive in her hand, then at the horizon where the sun was beginning to touch the jagged peaks of the Cascades. The struggle had cost them everything: their careers, their pasts, and their sense of normalcy, but they had dismantled the ghost that had haunted them. "What now?" Jackson asked, watching the authorities process the scene. "Now," Elena said, looking at the dog who had refused to give up. "We go home. We've done our duty, and for the first time in years, the world is actually going to be better for it." The truth is rarely a whisper. It is a roar that eventually reaches everyone, and today, that roar has finally reached the surface. Justice does not wait for permission, and it certainly does not fear the shadows, because even the longest night eventually bows to the rising sun.